And next to my great friend and former colleague, Katrin, this is, for those of you online, I want to convey, I guess, to you at least how pleased I am to be in a room with a lot of living, breathing human beings, including many that I used to work with. And it's great to see them. They've all gone on and gone back to being scholars. I was not a scholar and still am not a scholar, but I'm really looking, and maybe because of that, I'm really looking forward to this collaboration with Columbia and to our discussion today. And I do want to thank, without too much throat clearing here, but really a sincere thanks to our partners here at Columbia, to Professor Tom Christensen, to Sarah Jessup here at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, the Center for Korean Research, the Columbia China and the World program, and everyone else who showed up today. And Clint and Mai Presley also from KIEP for organizing this. We do hope, as Clint said, this is going to be an ongoing engagement. We're not going to cover everything about the Indo-Pacific today. And also, as Clint said, KEI, we're based in DC, but we have a core value of getting out of DC, and we're focused on Indo-Pacific. But I realize some of you, especially if you came with because of the Korea label here, may be thinking, why is an organization called the Korea Economic Institute 2 weeks before the Korean president arrives for a state visit in Washington up here in New York talking about the Indo-Pacific? Aren't there a lot of other things we can talk about in US-Korea relations, like the CHIPS Act and the IRA? And by the way, that's not the IRA in Northern Ireland. That's the other IRA that I've come to know so well in my latter career. Extended deterrence. Whether there's going to be a K-pop group in Washington next couple of weeks from now. Do allies spy on each other? There's always a lot of things to talk about the US-Korea relationship. And more seriously, this is also a visit, President Yoon Suk-yeol coming to Washington in 2 weeks. It's only the second state visit that President Biden is hosting in his presidency so far. It is with an ally. It's an ally with whom we are marking 70 years of alliance, 70 years since we signed a mutual defense treaty, which, by the way, is only about, I haven't done a word count, about 300 words long. It's pretty brief. And we're celebrating that in 70 years, the relationship between the United States and the Republic of Korea, out of the most, shall we say, tragic in many ways and unpromising and difficult to start. It's a terrible, terrible destructive war, and the continuing division of the Korean Peninsula has grown into something that I don't think anybody really imagined 70 years ago. So we're celebrating it, but we're also looking at where the alliance is now. And I think that gets us to why this topic is relevant, not only because to the topic itself, but in terms of US-Korean relations, about looking forward into the future of them. When President Biden and President Yoon met last year in 2022, when President Biden stopped in Korea shortly after President Yoon had come to office, they issued a statement that actually is a lot longer than the alliance agreement in 1953. It's about 9 pages long. A lot has happened in government work over the years. We haven't gotten shorter. But one of the things that it pledged was that the US and South Korea would build a global, comprehensive, strategic alliance. And it's really in that context, I think, that we see that not only the United States, but South Korea, and we're going to talk about other countries here as well, really do have a shared view of the need for a much more comprehensive, broader, regional, and indeed global approach to the challenges we face today. And certainly we see that this refrain, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot today, of strengthening alliances and partnerships, is at the very heart of certainly the US approach to the Indo-Pacific strategy. So we've got 4 excellent papers here today and their authors to talk about how this idea, this Indo-Pacific idea, is viewed in South Korea, Japan, China, and in Southeast Asia. But before we get to all that, and I will be very brief here, I think it's kind of worth asking sometimes, when did we start saying Indo-Pacific? I mean, in Washington, a lot of people's titles have changed to Director of Indo-Pacific this and Director of Indo-Pacific that, and maybe Columbia, you can tell us, and Hawaii. Yeah, that's right. And I was going to get to that. But, you know, this is still the Weatherhead Asia. I think the Asia Society is still the Asia Society. And I'm not trying to be too picky about words, but I think it is, I think as we talk to our larger audiences and talk about where we think this is headed, what do we mean by the Indo-Pacific? I mean, again, I'm not quite old enough to remember, but I know that the job that Danny Russell filled so well more recently But in post-World War II, that was the assistant secretary for, I think, the Far East, right? It used to be the Far East. The question was always far from what? Yes. But we moved from that to East Asia, which is considered kind of a big deal, right? In terms of how we think about the region. And then it turned into, for the State Department, I believe, East Asia and the Pacific, with the notion, and then the idea of the Pacific Century, and the Trans-Pacific relationship. So all those words, and now we've kind of moved to Indo-Pacific. It seems like it's happened fast. And I guess one question for us is this kind of another passing fashion, or is this Indo-Pacific idea, of something that's really going to take root and really shape the way that we think about architecture, security architecture, trade architecture, the architecture of our cooperation together going forward? I'm going to leave out some of I was recollecting with some of my colleagues I've worked with over the years. I'm going to leave out some of the details of that, but I've just to mention, now I say, Gil and I were talking about this, Professor Rosman. I remember being in Tokyo in 2006 or 2007, meeting with the then foreign minister, Taro Aso, who pulled out a map, and he didn't call it the Indo-Pacific, but it was the Indo-Pacific, and I just didn't know it then. And I remember reading a book now called Monsoon by Robert Kaplan, or The Indian Ocean and the Future of American Power in 2010, and hearing this idea of Indo-Pacific. And I remember, this is all very personal, there's a lot in between, but going to India then in 2014 as Prime Minister Modi came to office, and hearing that he was moving from a policy that was called Look East, India trying to focus its policy more towards the thriving economies of, including China, but especially Japan and South Korea and Southeast Asia, look east towards Asia, but moving from look east to act east and beginning to adopt this idea of an Indo-Pacific framework. And then, of course, as Professor Christensen had already reminded me, for the US, we really started using the word Indo-Pacific, at least within the government. And it started, I think, on the security side, the military side, with, in 2017, the National Security Strategy, changing from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific for the first time. And PACOM, for those of you who know the endless acronyms of the US military, the Pacific Command based in Hawaii, changed to the bigger mouthful, which I saw, of the US-Indo PACOM, so the Indo-Pacific Command. And these things actually matter. They actually matter, I think. And then, of course, with the Trump administration, also in 2019, the State Department issued a document called A Free and Open Indo-Pacific Advancing a Shared Vision, which for a while was known as FOIP. Fortunately, I think we stopped using that. But in a rare example, and I'm not going to be too political here, of some continuity, if you like, between administrations, the Biden administration did not drop Indo-Pacific. In fact, it's kind of doubled down on it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we had Secretary of State Blinken giving a speech in Indonesia in 2021, giving the framework, and then the White House itself issuing the Indo-Pacific strategy in February 2022, along with an action plan. And again, the refrain, given that there was continuity, I think, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and this emphasis on an Indo-Pacific concept, an important difference, I think, and it won't surprise anyone, is that the Biden administration has put, as I said, allies and partners right at the front. In fact, someone did a word count. It wasn't me. Maybe it was GP Chat or something. Well, it's not very. And in the Biden White House plan, allies and partners are mentioned 33 times. And I have to say, anytime I hear someone for the administration talk, they use it at least 33 times in the first 5 minutes. So this is the refrain. And what's not spoken about so often, of course, is China. It's not that there's no mention. But again, China's kind of that, and again, we'll get into that part that is not spelled out so much. But since then, and even before that, numerous other Indo-Pacific strategies have also been issued by our allies and partners. And I heard a Biden administration official say that one of the ideas of this was to have a conversation with our allies and partners, and sometimes something the US hasn't paid so it's been a one-way conversation, but really have a conversation. So I think there is a real welcoming of how others are approaching it. So today we're going to look at some of those plans. In addition, there are others: Australia, the EU. Australia was in very early, but even in Europe, the EU, France, Canada, all have issued separate Indo-Pacific strategies. And so it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. You can look on the KEI website, actually, for some articles about some of these others. But I think what we see is that this Indo-Pacific concept has certainly been accepted by many. China has a different view, and we'll hear about that as well. But I think that what we have now, and this is kind of my final point, is a lot of questions, because we're still at the very early stages of this. You know, what are the differences in perspective on what the Indo-Pacific means? Is this like the parable of the blind men and the elephant? No one's ever seen an elephant, and they all are feeling different parts and thinking it's a wall or a spear or a tree. And of course, what about China policy? Where does this leave China policy? If this is containment, somebody say this is an idea of containment, what does containment look like? And I recall that, remember George Kennan, who coined the word containment so long ago vis-a-vis the USSR, then insisted for many years afterwards that that the containment the US pursued was not what he meant by it. So what do we mean if we even want to approach a word or something like that? And by the way, where's the India in the Indo-Pacific? It seems to me that's kind of a more of an aspirational at this point than filled in part of this strategy. And also, of course, and this is something we hear a lot in Washington, what about the economic dimension of it? Something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Thank you, IPEF. IPEF has been established. But again, seems to, in the environment we're in, the economic environment, the growing protectionism, the word trade is a word that doesn't occur as often. Yeah. And, but so what does an economic framework look like if it doesn't follow some of the kind of frameworks that we've used before in negotiating free trade agreements and in other diplomacy? And finally, I mean, what about some of the other alphabet soup of multilateral organizations with which the US and our partners, and in some cases, China and or India are also involved? APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, which, by the way, the US will be hosting as a summit, I think in Seattle later on this year. What about ASEAN? I very much look forward to that program, to that. And overall, where is this headed? That's what we're going to start sort of talking about today. So again, I thank all of our participants for joining. I thank all the students who are here. I think you'll see there's a lot of papers here to write. There's a lot of research to do. And I think this really is a place where a need for real scholarship and thought about policy and where it's headed is very important. So another goal I think we have in coming here to Columbia is hope that we can get your minds involved in thinking about the universe of issues there are to think about when we consider whether or not the Indo-Pacific strategy provides the kind of framework for the kind of architecture that we want to see in the Indo-Pacific, in East Asia and beyond, and with our partners and allies and beyond. So thank you very much. And I will.
I will introduce the four papers, speak panelists in a moment. I want to say a little bit about the structural context of what we're doing, and say that I think Kathy set the scholarly tone for what this is. That is that KEI has shown me what a kind of think tank can do in reaching out to search for the overall dynamics of how the Indo-Pacific is changing. And I've been affiliated for over a decade, and the highest standards have been encouraged, and I've just been very impressed with that kind of work. Back in my days at Princeton, I enjoyed immensely working with Tom, and we often co-advised senior theses, and it was some of the most pleasant things I did at the university. And having been in Washington for more than a decade, I have to say that I'm even more impressed with the kind of discussions going on there. I think Washington is clearly the center of international conversation about how the world is being transformed, with an emphasis on Asia. There's so many interesting think tanks, and we're drawing heavily on the Washington think tank community and former government community as we proceed here, as well as international experts who've worked with that community. So let me just say structurally, what we've been trying to do in past panels and at this one as well, is to achieve a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. The idea is that there will be 4 papers and they will be planned in advance to address related, overlapping themes. And then we try to draw some broader conclusions through comparisons. This has been the way it's gone on and through the KEI projects repeatedly, and that's what we're trying to do today, with the emphasis on the timely subject of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. The US has strongly urged other countries to join US leadership of this program. And we now will see to what extent the others are joining, or do they have their own idea? Do they want to proceed precisely the way the US does, or they want to make sure they have some kind of autonomous input into that? So please think about that question as we listen to the 4 presentations. We start with the country that is known for being most similar to the US, most clearly overlapping with the US in its approach. But I think Yuki will tell us that there are some important differences here. Yuki, you're first.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So sorry that I would not be able to, I couldn't join you in person. Battling a couple of different time differences just was not feasible for me, but I very much wish that I could have been there in person. And thank you again, Gil and Clint, for giving me this opportunity. As Gil alluded to, Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy has a lot of similarities with that of the United States. And that is not a coincidence from the fact that it was actually late former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo who initially came up with the general concept of this Indo-Pacific and Japan as early as 2007. This was when he was a Prime Minister very briefly, right after Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro left. And really, he picked up steam on it after he returned to the office in December 2012. And the basically the roadmap that he paved had been followed by his 2 successors, Suga Yoshihide and now Kishida Fumio. And I have to say, during the previous administration in the United States, this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific was met with some sort of an agreement, but because of some of the differences, which I will go into a little later, it really had the, I guess, a limited level of acceptance, I would say. And it is really under the this current Biden administration that the 2 countries' strategy really comes into align itself with each other. So by 2023, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept has really become the centerpiece of definitely Japan, but it looked to me also for the United States, strategic thinking in rethinking of the regional architecture for this vast maritime space from that covers both Northeast Asia, from Northeast Asia all the way to South Asia. And Japan is in a full support of the US Indo-Pacific strategy. And when it revised its national security strategy in December 2022, the 2 countries' strategic strategies really showed a high level of alignment. And this was celebrated when the US and Japanese US Secretaries of State and Defense and Japanese Foreign and Defense Minister met in Washington, D.C. on the January 12th for their Security Consultative Committee. And they really celebrated that 2 countries Indo-Pacific strategy has the unprecedented alignment of their vision, priority, and goals. That said, though, I have to go back to the history of how this concept of Indo-Pacific strategy really has been evolving since when Abe Shinzo first came up with it in 2007. It's a nascent, so Abe, who had been by then, in 2007, he revealed the basic framework of this contour of this strategy during his visit to India in August 2007. And when he delivered the speech before the Parliament of India, he talked about the confluence of the two seas, and how he envisions Pacific Ocean area and the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean area needs to be really now considered as a one strategic space, given its connectivity and the importance of certain values and norms, such as freedom of navigation and rule of law, needs to be heeded in order for the stability and prosperity for this entire region to come through. Abe, after returning to the office in December 12th, articulated a much clearer vision of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. This you can see in the column that he contributed, named Asia's Democratic Security Diamond. This was published at the end of December 2012. In this, Abe argued that the peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Pacific Ocean are inseparable from peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean, unquote, and emphasized that the importance of a deeper cooperation with India and Australia is critically important for Japan moving forward. And he also, in this piece, interestingly enough, he also explicitly encouraged European countries, namely England and France in that particular piece, to be more engaged and involved in the Indo-Pacific region more robustly, arguing these two nations' involvement in this part of the world would benefit this strategic space tremendously. So what drove Abe to think about this? I can think of at least two major factors. And this really kind of culminated him coining this phrase as a free and open Indo-Pacific. By 2000, so one important driver for Abe to go into this road on his strategic outlook is Japan's relationship with China. By 2005, Japan-China relations was already troubled by many issues, but it really picked up the pace. Basically during the while he was actually out of the government, and when he came back to the office in December 2012, he really found he found a stronger sense of urgency in terms of laying out the vision for the this Indo-Pacific region staying as a region that certain rules and norms will be honored. And like I said, second and more importantly, Abe was actually concerned that China's rise was not countered by the US as robustly as he thought it should. And this leads to some of the differences of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy and that of the US, as much as there are a greater area of alignment. In particular, Abe was concerned about the prolonged US preoccupation in the Middle East, not only took US attention away from China's growing assertiveness in the region, but it also made Washington very wary of a sustained its leadership role in this region, despite the Obama administration's initial commitment to the pivot to Asia, rebalance to Asia, and so forth. So hoping to secure US continued engagement and more in the leadership role in that region, Abe threw down a full support when Obama administration launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership as one of the two key pillars of administration's Asia-Pacific strategy, and joined US in the decision of not joining China's Belt and Road Initiative, even as other US major allies in Europe decided to join the BRI at the last minute. And Abe's concern about the American disengagement, not just from the region, but overall from the international affairs writ large, continued to grow during the Trump administration. So that certainly led to sharpen his thinking of how Japan wants to see itself in the Indo-Pacific region. So this ended up being very consistent with the vision that he articulated in his Asia's Democratic Security Diamond piece. Abe made diplomatic moves to invest much in further deepening Japan's relationship with India, Australia, and Philippines in Southeast Asia. And also he really began to intensify Japan's effort in reaching out to NATO allies as well. So as I mentioned, this basic framework of Abe's Indo-Pacific strategy is picked up by Suga Yoshihide and Kishida Fumio. And Kishida Fumio actually added his personal touch by releasing his own Indo-Pacific strategy. And when I finalize my paper, I will talk about a lot more about this and all the diplomatic outreach that has been done since Abe left the office in the countries with the Indo-Pacific region. But Fumio Kishida delivered, again, coincidentally, it's not a coincidence that he delivered this speech during his trip to India, entitled The Future of the Indo-Pacific Region, Japan's new plan for a free and open Indo-Pacific. He acknowledged that Abe's 2007 speech, but also refers to the speech of Era of the Indo-Pacific, which Kishida himself made in 2015 as Abe's first foreign minister, arguing that this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific should be further developed, and Japan will continue to expand its cooperation with the countries in the Indo-Pacific region in the context of this free and open Indo-Pacific concept. His rhetoric is really built on the move that he had already taken through 2022. Kishida essentially argued that his baseline of vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific is quote unquote simple, identifying the 4 major elements such as enhanced connectivity in the region, respect for freedom, the rule of law, free of coercion, and pursuit of prosperity, support for diversity, inclusiveness, and openness, and choosing rulemaking through dialogue. Informed by this frame of reference, he argued that his vision of Japan's updated Indo-Pacific strategy stands on 4 key principles. So obviously, first principle is peace and rules for prosperity. Basically refers to the significance of upholding the universal values and norm, which was also prominently featured since Abe's time, in respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and opposition of unilateral changes to the status quo by force. Second principle is the Kishida highlighted addressing challenges in the Indo-Pacific way. Kishida stressed the importance of a global commons that includes areas such as climate, environment, global health, and cyberspace, and countermeasured against misinformation. He also argued that the countries in a region must address them in a practical and realistic way to ensure the resilience and sustainability of the region-wide efforts. The third principle Kishida identified was a multi-layered connectivity. He stressed the resonance between Japan's vision and ASEAN outlook for Indo-Pacific, considering them mutually reinforcing. He also discussed the importance of engaging countries beyond the Indo-Pacific region, not just Europe, but including Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and arguing that forging stronger ties with this out-of-the-region countries will help promote realizing the free and open Indo-Pacific vision better. Finally, Kishida referred to extending efforts to security and safe use of the sea to the air. Even though this free and open Indo-Pacific concept has tended to focus on the sea, given the region's vast maritime space, he also stressed that it is equally important to pay attention to the air portions of it, which he identifies as the other public common goods in the region. So these are the some of the major features that the Kishida put his own touch to this. And his adding these own personal touch to the Indo-Pacific strategy to update them was driven by the couple of factors. First, Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began in February 2022, played a big role in the refining Kishida's vision. And secondly, the major shift of the US approach toward China under the Biden administration was also a factor. And third, the shared value component of the free and open Indo-Pacific gained more prominence in the US approach toward Indo-Pacific strategy. And that was also the factor as well. And finally, as Japan deepens its engagement in multilateral diplomacy by regularizing the summit and ministerial meetings amongst the various partners, importance of anchoring these efforts firmly in the context of a US-Japan alliance has become very, very important. So how does a Japanese view and Biden administration's approach are similar and different? Japan, like I said, has the lot of similarities with the U.S., especially the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, which focuses on free and open connectivity, prosperity, and security, and resilience. However, there are a couple of differences. First and foremost, the tone of overall narratives in which each strategy is articulate is different. On the one hand, American vision places premium on democratic norms and institutions. On the other hand, Japan, as Kishida suggests, that the tackling these issues in the Indo-Pacific way, he takes a little bit less ideological approach, and a little bit more, I guess, a feasible, realistic approach that is also comfortable with the Southeast Asia and a Pacific island. And Japan's strategy, so like I said, I think Japan's strategy compared to US one is a little bit more ambiguous and nuanced. In fact, initial reaction to Kishida's updated Indo-Pacific strategy in Japan has been kind of unenthusiastic, with some critics that how it lacks the detail. But even without specific, however, there are here are the few elements that are different. So emphasis on democratic value is a lot more subtle. Secondly, Japan places greater importance of expanding partnership with countries outside the Indo-Pacific region. And third, Japan's version of an Indo-Pacific strategy emphasizes diversity, inclusiveness, and openness, suggesting that it envisions the Indo-Pacific area as a region for something rather than regions against something. In other words, Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy is built on the notion that the region is open for any country as long as it abides by the principles that Japan and the regional country regards as critical, such as respect for the rule of law, no use of force or coercion to change the status quo, etc., rather than a regional bloc that targets a specific competitor for competition or containment. So those are the few key features which I will continue to finalize as I finish up my paper. But I don't want to go on too long, so I'll revert the time back.
Thank you, Yuki. And now we go to Katrine.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I turned this off earlier. I'm good. Okay. Thank you, Yuki. So much to think about from your comments, and so glad that you kicked it off. You know, as Gil noted, I worked on the US-South Korea comparison. And so that was really interesting to dive into in and of itself. But I also really enjoyed reading the other papers, because I think one of the things I hope we can dive into today is comparisons of the comparisons. I think there's a lot to really unpack there. And so today I'm going to focus on my paper, which did really a deep dive of this particular comparison, but I hope that later we can kind of, you know, branch out, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers as well in doing that. That's really, I think, the great value out of all being here together, both virtually and in person. I echo Ambassador Stevens, Kathy's comments, in the depth of expertise, scholarly and policy expertise in this room. It's truly an honor to be here with all of you, and to be here and with many friends as well. to be here, both physically and virtually. So thank you all for gathering. I know there's a lot going on a Tuesday afternoon, so great to be together. And thank you, of course, to KEI and to Columbia for hosting. Always welcome trips back to New York. I lived here up to 2 years ago for a few years, and so it's wonderful to be back. The crux of my paper, I really took this comparison seriously. I really dove deep into the texts of both and put them right next to each other. Maybe I'm too much of a student still. This is what we're going to do. So maybe I did a bit of shortchanging on the background of the South Korea paper, which is in and of itself fascinating to look at the lineage and how much, I would say, this isn't in my paper, but I would say the biggest change in this strategy comes from South Korea. And it almost goes from a place more where Susanna's paper in the ASEAN place in terms of sensitivities, and it moves more towards the Japan. So there's just this is a really significant document for South Korea to have come out with. Again, I didn't cover it in my paper, but it's something that we can think about. The crux of my paper responds to two, I thought, what should I do here? I thought, what are people saying about this? So I start diving into what's the word on the street? What's the word out there, and what are the commentaries, and maybe start that way. So really what I did was to respond to two particular early critiques of the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released December 2022, so quite recently. And significantly South Korea's first ever effort to develop a comprehensive regional strategy. Of course, it's had other strategies in the region of various parts of the region, but this is the first comprehensive one. And these early critiques, both, I guess, good for this paper and this assignment, both of which involve comparisons to the US strategy, which was released early. This isn't the first US Indo-Pacific strategy, as we've discussed. This isn't the first US-Asia large strategy, whatever we're calling this region by any means. But the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy was released in February 2022. So the first of these critiques, which came mostly from the progressive side of the South Korean political spectrum, is that the strategy is too US-centric. As one Hankyoreh piece put it, South Korea's strategy is, quote, noticeably tilted toward the US. Another went a step further in characterizing the South Korean US strategies as identical visions for the region. That actually was a US critique, so I can't say this all came from one particular area of the political spectrum in the US or South Korea. The second critique, which came, a lot from U.S. commentaries, stressed the ways in which references to China differ between the two strategies, with the U.S. directly calling out very carefully in the U.S. strategy, call it the PRC, as a growing challenge engaged in harmful behavior, and South Korea identifying China in contrast as a, quote, key partner and emphasizing inclusivity and a clear effort to not antagonize Beijing. So in my paper, I did a side-by-side comparison of the two strategies, as I noted, examining the differences and similarities between them and assessing the validity of these early critiques, if they have it right or not. So my argument in a nutshell is that these assessments are generally accurate, but incomplete. So specifically argue that the South Korean strategy is less US-centric in its overall orientation and more aligned with the US position on China than these early commentaries suggest. So in the next few minutes, I'll provide a bit more detail on the elements of the South Korea strategy that led me to that conclusion. And then I'll wrap up with some kind of so what implications, perhaps, just to kick off implications of this assessment. Okay. So again, in modifying these early critiques, claim one from my paper is that the South Korean strategy is by design closely aligned with the US in mirroring Washington's policy positions across a broad range of issues, from regional order in North Korea to economic security and transnational challenges. But it's also by design takes steps beyond US positions to pursue Seoul's own distinctive objectives. So we could call this approach, this is a mouthful, US emulation coupled with independent supplementation. Sorry, good thing I'm not a speechwriter. And I don't think that's going to take off, but that's what I call Or, as the title of my paper suggests, maybe a little bit more simply, South Korea's efforts to cultivate regional boldness. This is something that the Yoon Suk-yeol administration likes this term, bold, right? Boldness from a foundation of US alignment. So how does this approach manifest, this kind of dual approach manifest in the strategy itself? Again, I won't go into full detail, but I'll highlight a few key examples. So key similarities across the two strategies include, importantly, the choice of Indo-Pacific is the main focus of today, and to Ambassador Stevens' earlier comments on the choice of this really strategic term for the region. I think that's one of the things that identifies it. What other regions have, we've called something that actually implies a strategy, that actually implies an exclusion of a certain country within the region. I think that's quite unique, right? In terms of thinking about its, at least that's the perception. Some will push back on that and say, well, it's actually not, it's inclusive, right? Which is something we can talk about. What is it, right? But interestingly, South Korea made the step, and this was a conscious step and a significant one, to use the term Indo-Pacific as a central strategic concept. So the prior Moon Jae-in administration was not willing to use this term. It used in kind of bilateral documents referenced Indo-Pacific, but not in South Korean documents, right? So this was President Yoon, clear decision to take on this really, as we know, Japan, but also US kind of favored term for the region. Interestingly, in terms of similarities, you look at the first line of both documents, they're almost verbatim. US says, the United States is an Indo-Pacific power. And the South Korean document says South Korea is an Indo-Pacific nation. And they both go on in a very mirroring sense, again, to the early critiques. They were very much, parallel and aligned to connecting directly the national interests of these countries to the Indo-Pacific, and going through some very similar statistics, right, to highlight that. The second, so choice of Indo-Pacific strategy, that as a concept is one clear similarity. Second, focus on advancing a values and rules-based order through collective efforts, right? The collective efforts is really the Biden thing, right? We think about like Trump versus Biden approaches to Indo-Pacific, as well as arguably the value and rules-based approach. Now, both of these are, especially the values side of things, is also kind of a step in the regional space that's new for South Korea. That the Yoon administration chose consciously to take on, and that was very much parallel with the United States document. Third, the decision to embed North Korea within broader regional security challenges. This isn't necessarily unique for the United States, deals with a lot of challenges, has to embed issues within the region, but for South Korea, this is significant. To not put North Korea, especially comparing it to the prior South Korean administration, embedding North Korea, I think it's within a counterproliferation section. It's quite deep into the document. Was a significant move, right? And that mirrored, the U.S. document as well as the general approach to North Korea. The U.S., the Biden administration approach and the approach are quite similar in terms of the content, but I'm just saying in terms of the strategy where the North Korea piece appears is also in parallel. Last two areas quickly, and importantly, pursuit of prosperity. So the economic area, both use this term, the last word of FOIP, both of them use prosperity. Interestingly, South Korea doesn't take on all of the identical terms, and you can talk about whether that's a conscious choice, but prosperity is in there. Pursuit of prosperity, economic security, and cooperation on new technologies is also quite, mirrored and reflected in both. Lastly, determination to build resilience to transnational challenges like climate change, energy security, and global health and pandemics is very much aligned. So we have these early critiques saying we're tilted toward the US. They look really similar. And I don't say they're wrong. Like there's a lot of overlap there. Clearly, there was a lot of inspiration from the US document, right? However, one thing that I noted, and maybe it's also just a matter of length, the US document's 18 pages, South Korea's document's 40 something, right? South Korea goes beyond in many of these areas. And I argue reaps unique gains and builds on these through its kind of the ways that it specifically, in a way that's complementary to the US strategy. It's not contradictory to it in this space, but it's unique, right? It goes beyond the US. So what do I mean by that? I'll just kind of put some meat on the bones of that claim. On the Indo-Pacific concept, South Korea highlights unique economic opportunities that flow from centering its strategy on the Indo-Pacific concept. As we all know, it's an export-reliant country, 85% of GDP relying on exports. Indo-Pacific represents, and this is in the strategy, it's referencing, that this is a very important region for South Korea's economy, represents 78% and 67% of total exports and imports respectively for South Korea. The majority of its top 20 trading partners are in the Indo-Pacific, and 66% of FDI is destined for Indo-Pacific for South Korea. By actually using this kind of footprint, it expands the range of countries that it actually covers in its regional strategy. And it's very clear to highlight that and the fact that it's an export-reliant country and all the stats. So it gains from that in this sense. Second example of how it kind of builds on the shared focus on collective action to strengthen the rules-based order. Again, both documents use very similar language in talking about the importance of collective action. But for South Korea, it does more than, I think, provide opportunities to align with the US. It also provides South Korea with a unifying rationale for dealing with these various parts of the region. So the new Southern policy of the prior administration worked with India and Southeast Asia. And I will reference Catherine Bado's great piece on this, in-depth study on this, and something that I delved into when I was looking at this, talked about the fact that that strategy was kind of lacking this unifying rationale, right? It was just kind of talking about countries, but not something to kind of unify South Korea's aims in working with these countries. But what the values-based kind of collective action kind of mantra does is it gives this unifying rationale for working with these various countries. It also gives a linkage between the global and the regional work that the alliance and very much the Yoon administration wants to do. Second, it gives a convenient rationale for some of the more sensitive areas of cooperation in the document, specifically the Japan, initiatives, trilateral US-Japan ROK, and certainly references to Japan are embedded in the talk of values, right? Likewise, when it comes to leaving China out, and it doesn't do this loudly in the document, it can do that through the values. It can say this is for values, it's not anti-China, right? I'm going to speed it up a little because I have 3 minutes, but you get the gist, hopefully, that basically South Korea is expanding, is getting more out of this document than just close alignment with the US. On North Korea, it's very adamant to talk about the global implications of the North Korea threat. That's something the US document doesn't do. What does South Korea get out of that? New partners to work on North Korea. It gets international pressure to work on North Korea, and it shows the world we can engage beyond the peninsula. So things that aren't just about US alignment, right? And aren't present in the US strategy. On economic initiatives, okay, this is a big one. A lot more South Korea can do and talks about RCEP, CPTPP. I won't explain those acronyms because I'm short on time, but hopefully those in the room understand these as economic initiatives the US is not involved in because of US constraints. And so it is very interesting to see how much more, and mention as well as concluding new trade agreements. These are absent. What does the US document say? It talks about IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and APEC. US is hosting 2023, South Korea will host in 2025. So they're aligned on that. It's not that they're not aligned. It's just South Korea can do a lot more. And it does. It talks about that in the strategy. Transnational challenges and technology. This document is very careful to talk about where South Korea's unique strengths are in the technology space, in the transnational challenges, nuclear energy safety, ODA. These are not just about US alignment. These are things they want to do in the region. South Korea wants to do in the region with other countries as well. Okay, so it's less US centric than these initial critiques suggest. Very quickly on the China side, what do I mean by it's not as or not as different from the US China approach than first meets the eye? Well, I mean, you first look at it, it does jump out, like the language in both is quite different. But the South Korea, and it's very muted on the South Korea side. Similarly, in the sense that the Kishida, I guess, version is muted on democracy. South Korea is muted on China. It doesn't mean it doesn't mention China, but it mentions it in very different ways. And I referenced the actual language there. So, but the whisper here is quiet efforts to nudge towards the US position. Maybe this isn't a good way to frame it, but it's almost like a bit of a gray zone tactic. There's not much for Beijing to aim at, but it's a new normal. It creates a new normal over time. It's these things slipped into documents. And over time we see, oh, that's South Korea's position now. When did that happen? Will it happen over a number of, announcements, but none of them were really a huge splash. So it's actually turning, I guess, China's gray zone tactics on its head a little bit. And not that that's the conscious effort of the South Korean, but it reminded me of that. It's these quiet, on South China Sea. We'll get into it's in the paper, South China Sea, on Taiwan, mirroring language that was in the bilateral document from 2022, linking security of Taiwan Strait directly to South Korea, but interestingly and significantly in a ROC only document. It's not in a bilateral alliance document, it's in an ROK document, right? Also expresses support for expanding cooperation with Quad and NATO. That's something Beijing definitely could get upset about. Takes implicit digs at Beijing without mentioning Beijing by name. One quote, the deepening arms race in the region coupled with a lack of action to build transparency and trust in the military and security domains. That's mostly understood to be talking about a certain unnamed country. I won't get into beyond the strategy, but it's done other things beyond this. South Korea's done other things beyond the strategy to show it's willing to nudge closer to the US position, even in the midst of, some pushback from Beijing, right? Okay, so implications of this, I've got probably. This analysis that I did, that I was happy to be able to do, and thank you for asking me to do it because I love diving into this kind of thing. It rounds out these early observations on South Korea's regional strategy regarding its degree of tilt towards the US and China. And these initial impressions matter. Why? Because unamended, they have the capacity to skew domestic within South Korea and external within the US narratives regarding South Korea's orientation in the region, which can impact the effectiveness and long run sustainability of the strategy. So within South Korea, a strategy perceived as leaning too far toward the US will become vulnerable, arguably already is vulnerable to attacks from the progressive side of the political spectrum, which tends to advocate for a more autonomous foreign policy for the ROK, thereby lowering its likelihood of survival beyond the Yoon administration. Within the US, a perception that South Korea is, quote, choosing Beijing over Washington, we've heard that line before over the years, has the potential to erode support for the many important areas of close US ROK cooperation that this strategy involves. So I contend that this might provide some perhaps useful material for those in the US and in South Korea that are looking to expand support for this strategy and are hoping to extend it beyond the current administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm on in the introduction I prepared, I go third and Susanna goes fourth. If that's okay, I will proceed and then we will come back to the discussants. And I'm going to be a little briefer, I think, because I really want to make sure we have adequate time for a wide discussion. I'll just start with the notion of the Indo-Pacific. China hates it. They've been attacking it repeatedly. And my paper is based largely on Chinese sources. So I essentially said, these are 10 or so articles in Chinese that help us understand what they think the US strategy is and how it's changed, and what by implication, we can learn about their strategy, which they don't spell out very much. And they don't like Indo-Pacific, but India loves it. Excuse me. And Russia's caught in between. Because they don't want to offend India, and they want to back China. I don't know what just happened, but I think what we're going to do is shift to Susanna and I'll come back with a better voice. It just happened. Susanna, can you go forward?
Sure, happy to jump in and thank you so much for the invitation to participate today, and to all the other panelists and speakers for their presentations. So I'll focus on the Southeast Asian approaches to the Indo-Pacific and talk about how those emerged in 2019 and the sort of the key distinctions between the US and Southeast Asian approaches. So I think the first point that I would make in this discussion is that, in contrast to the approaches that we've already heard about from South Korea and Japan, the ASEAN approaches to the Indo-Pacific are not really strategies at all, in the sense that I don't think they seek to sort of shape the region in a proactive way, but instead they should be understood as responses to the emerging strategic dynamic in the region. And the main document that I'll be referring to in this presentation is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, adopted at Indonesia's urging in 2019. And the reason that ASEAN adopted that document in 2019 was because at that time there was growing concern in Southeast Asia that the Indo-Pacific strategies from the United States and other countries in the region were going to marginalize ASEAN's own role and undermine this concept of ASEAN centrality that has been very important to the countries of Southeast Asia for a long time. In particular, I think from a Southeast Asian perspective, there's not a clear distinction between the idea of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. They see the Quad as being the sort of the key vehicle for driving Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Quad is something that has made the Southeast Asian countries quite uncomfortable. And so I suppose in some ways the default ASEAN response to that would be to not really do anything and to sort of continue on in their, in their status quo. But in 2019, Indonesia urged the other Southeast Asian countries to take a more proactive position and adopt this document, which is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So I'll go through that document in a bit of detail and talk about how it differs from the US Indo-Pacific strategies that we've seen. I think it's, in many ways, because it is a sort of a response to, rather than an endorsement of, US Indo-Pacific strategy, it's not at all surprising that there are many differences. In fact, even to the point that China last year came out and endorsed the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific and said that it was willing to work with Southeast Asian countries on it. That to me is a really interesting occurrence, given that, as we've heard from other speakers, China hates the concept of the Indo-Pacific when it's in the form advanced by the United States. So a few points of difference and distinction between the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific and US Indo-Pacific strategy. One I've already mentioned is the level of ambition. The ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific does not seek to change the Indo-Pacific region, but rather to bolster ASEAN's own role. So the actions that are identified in that document are really things about shoring up ASEAN's own centrality vis-a-vis other emerging groupings, not mentioned in the document, but implicit, being the Quad. Another sort of, I think, important point about the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific is that it's very much framed as seeking to maintain a current status quo against possible challenges, rather than seeking to reverse the trend of China's growing regional influence. The ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific is framed quite positively, as, along the lines of, this is a region that has been peaceful, has been prosperous. There are possible risks to that, and so we need to act to avoid those risks, rather than anything more dramatic or ambitious. Another point that I think is important here, without wanting to go too much into the sort of semantic questions about the Indo-Pacific and its geographic scope, is that the Southeast Asian countries are reluctant to endorse the idea of the Indo-Pacific as one inclusive region, as we've seen in other Indo-Pacific strategies. So the way that the document is phrased portrays ASEAN as being at the center of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and very much maintains the idea that those two regions are separate strategic theatres. And I think the reason for that, from a Southeast Asian perspective, is a concern that if the region is framed in that broader way as the Indo-Pacific, then it potentially dilutes the importance of Southeast Asia. If the region is narrowly framed as Asia or Asia-Pacific, I think Southeast Asia's own importance and centrality is quite evident. But in that broader concept, it potentially becomes a more competitive space for ASEAN to advance its objectives. So one similarity between the ASEAN approaches and that of other regional Indo-Pacific strategies, including the United States, is an emphasis on the maritime domain. That very much reflects Indonesia's perspective as an archipelagic country and the one that pushed this forward. But it's important to note that the way that the maritime domain is discussed in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is very much in terms of economic cooperation. So looking at issues like maritime connectivity, fishing, in maritime infrastructure, etc., rather than predominantly a focus on security cooperation, as we see in the US Indo-Pacific strategy. I mentioned already about the emphasis on bolstering ASEAN's own roles, but I think that that this idea around inclusive regional groupings is also very important for the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So the idea that it's important to pursue cooperation with the widest range of possible partners, cooperation being seen not just as the outcome of strategic trust with a preferred range of partners, but rather as a building block to establishing strategic trust, is very much the way that ASEAN sees the world and sees the region. And so you won't find in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, as you do in, for example, US Indo-Pacific strategy, the idea of a hierarchy of partners, or the idea of certain preferred partners being singled out on the basis of strategic trust, but rather there's an openness to working with all partners depending on what they're willing to bring to the table. And also, I think, related to that, a wariness about so-called exclusive groups in which not all countries have the opportunity to participate. So very much a wariness about minilateral groupings such as the Quad. Related to my point about a willingness to cooperate based on what external partners are willing to bring to the table is a very heavy focus in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific on economic cooperation. And that really drives all of the sort of priority areas in the ASEAN outlook. So from maritime through to infrastructure, through to the other areas of cooperation that are identified, all of them really have economics at their core, and security issues are given only a light treatment. That's probably because of the difficulties that Indonesia faced in 2019 in encouraging other Southeast Asian countries to be willing to sign up to a document that had this terminology of Indo-Pacific in it. More recently, Indonesia's been looking for ways to implement the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And again, that's been primarily economic. So later this year, during its year as ASEAN chair, Indonesia is going to be hosting a big infrastructure forum. And so that's very much how it sees sort of operationalizing the Indo-Pacific concept. There has been some discussion about whether or not Indonesia would be able to secure ASEAN support for a more security-focused document on the Indo-Pacific, but at this point, it doesn't look like that's likely. And maybe just to conclude my remarks, since 2019, the use of the word Indo-Pacific in Southeast Asia has become more widespread. For example, the Philippines has started to use it more. Singapore has used it more. Notably, those countries use the terminology in their discussions with the United States and other regional partners. It's still something that most countries probably don't naturally turn to in terms of the way that they conceive of the region, apart from Indonesia. And so there still is an element of skepticism, I think, about what Indo-Pacific strategy means. There's still very much a view that the concept of Asia-Pacific encompasses a spirit of cooperation, whereas Indo-Pacific is shorthand for competition and potentially confrontation with China, which is an approach to the region that no Southeast Asian country can endorse. So I think there are still some challenges there for the United States in terms of articulating a strategy that is acceptable to and can be bought into by the Southeast Asian countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Susanna. The point that I think stands out the most in my reading of Chinese articles over the last year or so is how fundamentally things have changed, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, they don't use that term. That is something they oppose because it suggests that it's not Asia that's becoming unified, becoming integrated under Chinese leadership, but it is a wider region that stands opposed to what China's trying to achieve. I regard 2022 as fundamentally transformative in this region and the way Taiwan is approached and the way US foreign policy has evolved and responded. I think 2021 is somewhat of a transitional year. The previous period, I would say China was largely on a roll. Xi Jinping was feeling confident. Chinese articles were pretty confident about such things as driving a wedge between the US and various other countries. They're back a little bit in 2023 to a more assertive strategy with the Macron visit and so on. But I think 2022 was a bit of a shock to China in a variety of areas. And a lot of it had to do with the Biden administration's leadership. And the leading theme I would regard for the year is not the military transformation in the Indo-Pacific and not the values themes, but economic security. It's a real rethinking of not so much trade, but economic security. And the semiconductors became a kind of symbol of that, with Japan and South Korea both in the forefront on that. So let me just give you a sense of what I see some of the Chinese concerns were that were expressed in this year about the changing US strategy. And with I think a hesitation or uncertainty about what China's response would be. One deals with Japan's wholesome embrace of what the US was doing. I think they saw Kishida as going far beyond Abe. What they had been hoping for as late as the first half of 2020 was a summit with Abe and a fourth. fundamental paper about Japan-China relations. And things turned in a very different direction. So that was one shock, and the 2% defense budget plan of Japan goes along with that. What Katrin said was the huge change in South Korea from Moon to Yoon is really fundamental as well. And with China generally regarding South Korea as the shakiest country in the US orbit, the country they thought they had a good chance of unhinging from the US leadership, the alliance system. In certain ways, it might be a gradual process, but that changed fundamentally. Another achievement that Chinese writings comment on in a more worrisome way than a year earlier was the AP4, the connection between NATO and the Asia-Pacific 4 countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, that really far-reaching because they really wanted to keep these two arenas very separate. The Quad and AUKUS and India, after all, the big change in India occurred only after the middle of 2020. And although China is trying to pull India back to some degree, this was a really big transformation. So I think it's China that we usually don't recognize as having driven bipolarity. There's so much focus on what the US does and how the US is the driver of change with our US-centric approach to foreign policy. But really, if you look not so much at what China says about a win-win relationship, but about what they say about what they won't accept. And that what they won't accept is so basic to what the US and US allies want and what some other countries want, that really is the driver of bipolarity. And I take that in the 2010s, we reached the kind of acme of trilateralism, where Russia, Japan, and South Korea were all exploring different ways of working through triangles to transform the region to their own liking. Whereas I think under the impact of China's behavior, with the response led vigorously by the Biden administration, we've seen a real pushback to that, and the US has had the momentum, the initiative in setting up new organizations, in talking about strategy, in trying to implement elements of that strategy, particularly the economic security elements that I think are really troubling to China. And that's the take I came away with from these Chinese writings, that they were very troubled by what had happened in 2022. Now, there may be some movement towards a new Chinese approach now, but basically the Chinese tried to explain it in ways that were inexplicable, rather than talking about the impact of the Russia invasion of Ukraine and China's response, or the sudden increased salience of Taiwan as a factor in driving the US foreign policy and Japanese foreign policy and affecting regional strategy. They kept talking about US Cold War mentality to contain, as if that was what the US was doing, and that their interpretation of the Korean War is essentially along those lines. It was the fault of the US Cold War mentality. And Japan's pre-war mentality came back up. So to argue that Japan had caught in his old thinking, that's no way to try to figure out solutions that can address the real problems of this period and problems that China has often generated. So let me just highlight a few elements of the U.S. strategy and stop so we have plenty of time for discussion. Many lateral coalitions. So the U.S. is much back. That was not the Trump approach. That is certainly the Biden approach, flexible and doing that. Traditional security deterrence to prepare for contingencies, with Taiwan now the focus in one area, but the Ukraine spillover is huge. The same officials in the administration who are dealing with the response to Ukraine are dealing with the response to China to a great extent. The economic security overlap is considerable. You know, what do they have to do to prevent Russia getting access to certain dual use items is essentially what they're saying about China. So there's not, I think, despite what some people in Asia are saying, it's not that the US is arguing at the top that it's trying to prevent or contain China's rise. It's trying to contain China's aggressive pursuit of regional hegemony and trying to make countries aware of how China is using economic dependency to try to oblige them to follow China in terms of certain values and also eventually in terms of security. And so much centers on dealing with security over trade, economic security over trade, values, but I don't think the stress is as much on democracy as some say, even though we have these summits for democracy. I think it's much more a stress that overlaps with Japan's on a rule-based order, no use of force to change the status quo, values centered on supporting Ukraine and supporting Taiwan in terms of preventing coercion against it. And so this is the way I see the challenge to China. They're stuck with a very different US approach, a much more effective approach, and they have to come up with a new strategy. And so I'm beginning to see, having finished my paper, already some signs of shifts in China towards Japan, towards India, and so on, giving up on the US, but thinking they can drive a wedge again after last year, deciding that it looked pretty hopeless. So I'll stop there and now turn to our discussions. Which one of you is going to go first? Please come up. Well, why don't we sit here with no difference?
Okay.
Yeah, we can mix.
It's bringing the band back together, Gil.
Okay, we'll play
I'm gonna grab.
we'll play Old Nassau.
Thank you. Thanks for all your help. So my job is to discuss Gil Rosman's and Susanna Patton's papers. I like all the papers, so I'm gonna actually try to contribute something by, instead of criticizing, to supplement and to ask you some questions to consider. I think all the paper writers do a good job of comparing and contrasting the US approach to the Indo-Pacific strategy and those of Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. I also commend to you Gil Rosman's introductory chapter, which probably people haven't seen, but it does a good job of bringing this all together. I could see it as a kind of volume. I guess it's going to be a journal edition. The differences are really not only in strategy, but in concept. The United States seems to have much more focus on China and strategic competition with China than any of the other actors, with Japan a close second. especially in the past few years, as Yuki laid out so well. Korea, a more distant third on that score, but as Katrin said, moving closer to Japan in the last few years, with ASEAN wanting much less to do with this concept of choosing between the United States and China in a strategic competition. So ASEAN is a distant fourth in terms of proximity to the United States. The concept of the Indo-Pacific, as was pointed out, was originally Japanese, not American. I think this is an important thing to emphasize. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was not an Obama administration initiative. It was not an American initiative. It started in the Bush administration years, and we started negotiating in those years. In the second term, it was created by 4 members of APEC. RCEP, which is a large multilateral trade deal in the region, was not a Chinese initiative. China is just the most powerful economy in it. It was an Indonesian idea by SIPA's own Mari Pangetsu. So these ideas don't have to come from the United States to be used, or from Japan or major powers always to be used in ways that further the interests of the great power. I agree that the United States, with Gil, that the United States has done a very impressive job during the Biden administration of solidifying relations with the region through a panoply of achievements. Improved bilateral relations with Japan and the Philippines stick out to me. Mini-lateral arrangements like the Quad and AUKUS. And I think doesn't get enough attention, the U.S. role in facilitating rapprochement between 2 U.S. partners, Korea and Japan, which has been a constant frustration. And I just should point out that, it's great to be back with Gil, who's my Princeton colleague. It's really great to be here with Kathy Stevens, who is a great colleague, a great friend, and was a great boss. And she is a real champion of the United States at home and abroad, and it's a real privilege to be with her. But I can remember when we were always wrestling with this, even when we had common interests with Korea and Japan, like in the 6-party talks, very difficult to get them on the same page. So that's a big achievement, and I give them credit for that. Korea and Japan are always so often divided by historical issues. Gil also outlines, I think importantly, how AUKUS and the NATO plus the AP4, is it AP4, brought Europe into the East Asia region more than it has been in the past. But I have to say, I think they've done a very good job, particularly in comparison to the Trump administration, which I think did tremendous damage to U.S. allies and partnerships, alliances and partnerships in the region and around the world. But I don't think the Biden administration, for all their skills and all their experience, could have achieved anywhere near what they have achieved without China's own assertiveness and China's own driving of countries toward the United States, including in Southeast Asia. And some of it has been rather remarkable. I would say the Philippines transformation has been quite remarkable. Where I probably differ a bit from the tone of Gil's paper is I don't see it as a kind of unadulterated success story. It's dramatic in that you're comparing 2021 to the present to the 4 years previous, where the United States was kind of shooting itself in the foot over and over again. But there are some real challenges. And I think that the United States might struggle in maintaining persistent concrete cooperation from the regional allies and partners that you mentioned in challenging Beijing's assertiveness. And I think it's particularly true in relation to the most likely flashpoint in the region and maybe among great powers anywhere in the world. Even with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, cross-strait relations and differences over Taiwan still could be the most likely flashpoint for a great power conflict. And I think it's going to be hard for the United States to keep countries cooperating with the United States robustly and persistently if tensions are related to Taiwan increase, because not all countries, as Gil knows, share all of the Americans' views on these things. I think we've seen challenges with the European piece, most blatantly evidenced by President Macron's visit to Beijing with corporate executives, and most important, his statements about Ukraine as a European priority, but Taiwan not as a European priority on his way home. That was a real blow, I think, to this initiative. Those blows often come from France, I know, but it still is a major European power, and he was trying to speak, as he often does, for Europeans, not just for France. So I think this is important, not because France was ever going to play an important military role in the Asia Pacific in support of the US allies, but because Beijing might feel like it's more immune from European economic sanctions against China if Beijing were to use force against Taiwan, and it may encourage Beijing this notion that it can drive wedges between the United States and its allies over issues like potential Chinese support, even for Ukraine, and that's a problem. I think that Korea and especially Southeast Asian states are loath to see an assertive U.S. posture towards cross-strait relations that might lead to war. And that relationship is very fraught. The U.S. PRC differences over Taiwan are getting more sharp and more dangerous. And I think Susanna Patton does a great job in her paper of laying out how ASEAN and especially Indonesia like to see themselves not as a participant in this bipolar struggle between the United States and China, but as a bridge between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And I'll quote her here, and I think it underscores the theme of her paper, which is, there are fundamental disagreements between the United States and Southeast Asian countries about how to engage China. I've also often thought of ASEAN as a kind of canary in the coal mine, that if ASEAN states start leaning hard towards China, it probably means US policy is screwing up. And if ASEAN states are leaning very strongly towards the United States, it probably means Beijing's policies are screwing up, because it's not their tendency to lead. Right? It takes a lot of momentum to get them to lean in any direction. Just as a side note, I still think ASEAN is very important. We can maybe talk about that in the discussion period. I still think ASEAN is one of those organizations that you wouldn't miss until it went away, right? So it doesn't seem to be doing all that. But if there was no ASEAN, you wouldn't have this canary in the coal mine role. And you could also imagine Southeast Asia being divided up into competition between US and China in very dangerous and destabilizing ways for the region. So the fact that ASEAN holds together, I think, is important. Whether it's ASEAN centrality or ASEAN existence, or one way or the other, I think it's an important role that ASEAN plays. Most of the ASEAN states still do, although they're quiet about it, appreciate the US military presence in the region, most of them. They don't want to be left at the mercy of a large Chinese neighbor. But I still think that the biggest problem, this is what I would urge you to emphasize. I know you talk in your comments today about how economic security has been a driver of the Biden administration's policy. Well, yes, to some degree, especially on high-tech export controls towards China, and trying to urge others like Korea, Japan, the Netherlands to join in on those things. For sure, that's been an important aspect of the policy. But I would say a more striking aspect of the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific is the lack of an economic policy. That there really isn't a major economic component. And as Susanna points out so well, for ASEAN, economics is first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. It's at the core of everything they talk about. And the United States is simply absent. The US withdrawal from TPP, not an American idea, but a good idea, was a disaster. It's a bipartisan consensus in the United States. Even Secretary Clinton, when she was running for office, said she was going to scrap the TPP, because you have to say that apparently in American domestic politics. I'm a dinosaur. I'm an old-fashioned pro-globalization free trader, but I don't have a lot of allies in American politics these days. And I think that that is a major lacking in U.S. strategy towards the region, particularly in competition with China, because China's now flirting with the CPTPP. It is a member of RCEP, which is a very large organization. It's a free trade organization. There's lots of pro-globalization things going on in the US absence. And China has benefited from that. And digital economy arrangements are also being participated in by China. Anything multilateral involving economics seems like the United States is allergic to that possibility. So I think that's a major problem. And the biggest problem of all is that to get deals, the United States needs to allow market access. And market access to the United States right now is just poison in American domestic politics. The other aspect of US policy was raised by Gil, and I think it hasn't been a successful effort in American diplomacy, going back to the Trump administration into the Biden administration, to paint China's Belt and Road Initiative as primarily predatory and as primarily damaging to the recipients of the loans. There are a lot of problems in the Belt and Road Initiative, and the recipients who suffer those problems know it. And they push back often when it happens, right? But I don't think they see it. Most recipients see it fundamentally as a negative thing. After all, they ask for the loans. And when US diplomats go to these countries and say, China's economic policies are predatory, it doesn't go over well. My last trip to Southeast Asia because of the pandemic, 2019, I went to Malaysia, Thailand, I went to Singapore, and I went to Indonesia. Especially in Indonesia and Malaysia, this narrative that China's economic loans, its development loans to Malaysia and Indonesia are predatory, goes over like a lead brick. You're telling post-colonial nationalists that they are prey. So you're basically saying, you guys are dupes. Don't you realize you're dupes? That doesn't really play well. And I think that has been a major driver of both Trump administration and Biden administration policy on economics. And then the last piece, which is the real kicker, is the United States hasn't really had an alternative. So the US goes there and says, don't take that money. Don't take that money. And then say, well, where's your money? And another thing the United States is unable to do is to get domestic political support for a very proactive federal government program to assist in development. Here, Japan has done a lot better, and I don't think there's enough attention. Maybe you can have more attention in your volume on this matter, because Japan is competing quite well with China in certain areas of Southeast Asia and elsewhere in development lending, cleaner, more effective projects. So it's got something to bring to the show rather than just criticism. What the US brings is the Blue Dot Network, which is basically saying, we'll get a bunch of countries together to judge whether your loans are smart or not, whether they're sustainable, rather than we'll judge if they're smart or not. And if they're not smart, we'll give you better loans. That last piece is missing. And I think that that's an important factor for the limits to which the US can succeed. And again, I return to my earlier comments that I think Gil's paper is excellent at laying out all of the accomplishments and achievements that the United States diplomacy has had in East Asia in the last few years. So my recommendation for the US that would come out of all this would be to build on the accomplishments laid out so well in Gil's paper, take seriously the analysis of Susanna about the economic centrality of the strategies of the Southeast Asian states, which are really being competed over, in a sense, by China and the United States, even if they don't want to be part of that competition. And actually try to create, maybe with this pitch that this is a national security imperative, try to create some more openness to multilateral economic cooperation, and maybe even, I know it's way out there, maybe even some plan for infrastructure development in East Asia that provides a better option than some of the Chinese money, rather than just criticizing the Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't seem to be bringing us at many points. So I have a few questions. My first question is to Will, just to Gil, mostly about analysis of why Chinese authors are saying it's all America's fault. And I wonder how much that is the kind of traditional, the China specialists like you are saying, well, it comes from the Opium War. Xi Jinping talks about the Opium War and he talks about Japanese imperialism and China's a victim and, we're a victim again, we're a victim again. Or how much of it is the current situation in China, the current domestic political situation in China, where everybody is so reluctant to appear critical of Xi Jinping's strategy that you just don't want to say, we're on the wrong track, boss, because the boss is so powerful and so punitive to anybody who seems to cross him. There's so many high-level officials like Kathy and I worked with in the State Department who are in jail for life in China. It's really remarkable. I thought about it. Military, commerce, even foreign ministry. And so who wants to cross this leader by saying it's not America's fault? We kind of brought it on ourselves. That being said, there does seem to be some adjustment, some response to stimuli in recent weeks. They seem to be reaching out more to Europe, not just the Macron visit, but even before that. And they seem to be trying to tamp down some of the tensions in the region. So that suggests that maybe they can understand. And then to Susanna and to everybody who's written a paper, I wonder how sturdy some of this analysis is to shocks. So what happens if China sells lethal materials to Ukraine? It can't resist anymore. Putin's doing too badly on the battlefield. Xi Jinping can't stand to see Putin fail abroad and therefore potentially fall at home. And they start to sell a bazillion artillery cells and drones, military drones to Russia to support Russian war on Ukraine. Will these various multilateral, minilateral, bilateral arrangements hold? And in particular, will India stick in the quad if the United States presses Australia and Japan to really turn the screws on China for doing this? If there's a change in politics in some of the key member countries. So I'm struck by Katrina's discussion of Korea. Korea has always been so divided, but it seems even more divided today than it has been in the past. And Yoon is being called a traitor on a regular basis by his opposition. It's not like we disagree with your policy. It's feckless. It's that you're a pro-Japanese traitor to Korean nationalism. And that's pretty severe. So if that changes, what happened? The Philippines, it's been, I would say, remarkable. If you told me 4 years ago that the Philippines would be agreeing to do the things with the United States that it's doing now, but the Philippines constitutionally has a 6-year presidency. And if you get a different president, does this all last? How robust are these changes that we're seeing in terms of Indo-Pacific concept and the proximity of the various actors' concepts with the United States? And I don't want to talk about the United States because it's too depressing. But we're gonna have a national election. I'm a Groucho Marxist. I've been, I would never join a party that would have me as a member. I've been an independent my whole life, but I'm very disturbed about trends in American politics, and I'm not so sure that this robust, security-oriented strategy of bringing allies together that Gil has laid out so well is sustainable in a very volatile U.S. domestic political environment. And the last thing is, what if the balloon goes up over Taiwan? On a good day, Taiwan is a source of bonding between the United States and Japan. It's a source of tension to some degree between the United States and South Korea, because South Korea doesn't really want the U.S. to use its forces in the region for that purpose. They want us to focus on North Korea. And it's a source of great difference with everybody else. With the states that Susanna studies, it's a source of great difference. And India, I don't know. India some days talks democracy, sometimes not. Will India stick with the United States if things get worse in cross-strait wars? I don't know. So robustness is something I'm interested in, because one of the things that run through all the papers is how much change there's been. Maybe Gil's is the most dramatic, from Trump to Biden, but Katrina has big change in hers. Susanna has some change in hers because Indonesia was able to convince the Southeast Asian states to make a joint statement about the Indo-Pacific. That alone is a big deal. Anything that happens jointly in ASEAN is a big deal. But how sustainable and how robust are these changes? So I've spoken for too long. I really enjoy the papers. I'm really glad we're collaborating with you. It's great to see Gil again. And the fact that you reached out to us and Clint reached out to us and Kathy Stevens shows up, who's one of my favorite people. It just made my day.
What great hospitality. Danny?
Thanks. Why does talk by Tom Christensen feel like a roller coaster ride?
Because
didn't-
it's nauseating.
I didn't scream. No. Filled with enthusiasm. No, this is fun. These are all great presentations, including Tom's. I am definitely not an academic, and I'm not an experienced commenter. And I've only read the Japan and the Korea papers, so I look forward to reading Gil and Susanna's papers as well, and a little bit of a handicap there. One thing I'd throw out up front is that Indo-Pacific strategy isn't necessarily the same thing as a national security strategy. In fact, it's not the same thing. And the US has written both. Japan has a national security strategy document. South Korea published its Indo-Pacific strategy. So there are asymmetric comparisons, I think, involved here. It may be a given that the Indo-Pacific strategy is going to say less about national priorities and less about enhancing national security, and is going to say more about regional approaches and policies, multilateralism, and so on. I will also make a confession as a longtime policymaker that I had and have a certain amount of skepticism about government public strategies. When I was in the NSC, I did not, I'll confess, put a lot of stock in these sort of policy documents. That's a function maybe of being a practitioner, not a theorist. I tended to regard them as kind of after the fact summaries or explanations of what we were doing long after we had decided what to do, and in fact were actively engaged in trying to do it. So more of an explanation than a roadmap, more of a speech than a battle plan. And we certainly weren't promulgating strategies for the purpose of informing the members of the US government what the directions were. If they didn't understand our strategy at that point, God help us. But now, I've left government, I'm in the think tank world, I'm a lot more tolerant about these documents. And certainly they can provide important clues about the administration's approach, its goals, its priorities, and so on. But that comes in hand with what we can see from, the other forms of evidence, like the things that it does and other statements that it made. So I think we should temper our analytic enthusiasm looking at the papers per se, and make sure that we're also looking at the other indicators. The national security strategy is not the Talmud, it's not gonna contain the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx. But we should be looking, as the authors did, at what they reveal about the administration's thinking, assumptions, political constraints, and so on. And of course, how these strategies stack up against the actual national policies and behaviors that we can see. One, however, having dissed national security strategies and Indo-Pacific strategies, one really interesting thing in the American Indo-Pacific strategy that seems not to be replicated elsewhere is that it contains an action plan. And now it's not really a plan, but it does importantly, I think, set up certain benchmarks against which the administration can expect to be judged. on its actual policy implementation. So in terms of resource allocation, in terms of working with and to strengthen ASEAN, in terms of delivering on Quad promises and so on. I think that's important. So I read with great interest both Yuki and Katrin's papers, both very good papers. Obviously, there are many differences in the substance. There are some differences in the approach too, a bit in that the Japan paper focuses a little more on the comparison of various leaders, as you mentioned, Katrin, whereas the Korea papers principally focus on the Yoon administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. And there's no one right answer. I do think it's interesting to sort of trace as you call it, the political lineage, and the continuities, the discontinuities. Admittedly, like the US, the South Korea system is a two-party system, whereas the Japanese system is a one-party system. So there are going to be some differences in continuity there. I thought that was I think also it would be interesting to get a sense of how much the South Korea paper references Japan, how much the Korea paper references South Korea, and what can you deduce from that? And there are other things that might benefit from not just a comparison with the US, but a comparison between Japan and Korea, particularly on issue sets like, for example, technology. So with respect to the Korea paper, I was struck, Katrin, by your observation that the focus on the rules-based order and these values and principles is a way of setting a framework where Seoul isn't opposing China, it's not excluding China, it's merely defending the rules-based order and collaborating with countries that share these values. And if China is kind of self-selected out of that group, like not on us, that's just the reality of the situation. I agree, and I think that's an intriguing and probably well-founded observation. I'd also say that the relative subtlety and moderation in the degree to which the Korea Indo-Pacific strategy refers to China, and here again, comparing it to the United States is kind of a high bar because we're practically frothing at the mouth when it comes to China. Although not in the US Indo-Pacific strategy like that. But of course, we had a separate China strategy. Not let that go unmentioned. But it's also a function, as my Korean friends have told me, and I'm sure they tell you constantly, a function of a millennia of coexistence, and more to the point, being invaded repeatedly by China. To Tom's point, Korea in particular doesn't need to be told that China presents serious challenges. And therefore it doesn't feel the need to be Paul Revere and try to wake up the rest of the world about it either. One thing that occurred to me reading your paper was whether, to some extent, the Korean invocation of the defense of these liberal principles, etc., was intended, at least to a degree, to help to rationalize and protect the domestically controversial Moon government's effort to repair and restore ties with Japan. Did that serve a kind of secondary purpose? And also intrigued at, maybe it's an overstatement to say downgrading North Korea, downgrading the North Korean threat, but certainly to subsume it as part of the proliferation challenge as opposed to the be all and end all of South Korea's national security policy, which it has. Is it that Seoul is seeking to show that it's looking beyond the Korean Peninsula? This has been a chronic effort with mixed success? Or is there a little more to it than that? I don't know. And can we derive any clues about Seoul's view of nuclear weapons from strategy, or its own sense of vulnerability from North Korea, given that this document emerged against the backdrop of the accelerated tempo of missile activity and nuclear arsenal building. And related to that, is there clues, does it connect in some way to the anxiety about extended deterrence, or the bogeyman of, the ROK developing an indigenous nuclear program in the future? You point out there's a great importance placed on trade and economic engagement in the region by the government and by in the paper. And the strategy offers a rationale, I think, for why citizens in Korea should care about that. It struck me that although it pays lip service to the US initiatives, IPEF rather, and APEC, these are weak tea, and it goes on, talks about RCEP, goes on to talk about CBTP and so on. All these things are important. Similarly, on the technology side, the digital partnership agreement and so on. But I also wonder if the strategy in any way is predictive of the future. Is it telling us something about where Korea is going, or is it just a list of acronyms? You point out that the strategy, you say, shows a willingness to gradually defy Chinese preferences, mentioning Taiwan semiconductors. I wonder if that would be more persuasive if there was more to say. You mentioned in Sukil ducking Nancy Pelosi, foot dragging on the Fab 4 chip initiative and so on. So I put a little bit of a question mark right there. And then just sort of back to the political lineage question. And this is ignorance on my part, and each of us may have a different view, but I mean, I'm very conscious that even within the conservative camp in Korea, there are real differences between the Park Geun-hye group and the Lee Myung-bak group, particularly with respect to how China is skeptical, China curious they are. And I wonder what we can see in the Yoon government's Indo-Pacific strategy that tells us something about reconciliation of, these somewhat divergent approaches. And that obviously connects to the sort of political factor in national strategy. Yuki, also fascinating, great paper. I learned a lot. I lived through some of this. And I think you're very right. It's very important to really, not just a matter of assigning credit, but of really seeding the parentage of this concept of a free and open Pacific network concept that's inclusive of India, inclusive of the Indian Ocean, in Japan, in Abe and the Abe government. And I think that the United States embrace or engagement in the Obama administration helped to operationalize it. That made it less abstract, less aspirational. I think the absolutely critical factor was the advent of Modi as prime minister. And I myself kind of lived through the transition when suddenly India woke up, and the Indian diplomats who had been inert in the first few years of my engagement, suddenly, who knew they could speak? And they're actually very, very strategic, very, very smart people. Why weren't they talking to us before? In any event, balancing and hedging against China is an important factor in driving the development of FOIP in Japan, absolutely agree. And also middle power diplomacy and multilateralism, driven by doubts about US resolve and staying power. That is, I think that's critically important, and it is not limited to the Trump era. It's something that American policymakers have to be very, very much aware of and humble about. And you mentioned, I think, with great validity, not only is there concern about the return of Trump or a Trump-like president who will reverse American policies and abandon allies in favor of number one in 2024, but also the democracy versus autocracy narrative and either economic decoupling or the gaping hole that Tom described, where our economic and trade policy should be. I'm curious about your reference to Japan's national security strategy emphasis on cooperation with an eye to the global south. Because as Tom alluded to, Japan's active engagement, not only in, for example, Southeast Asia or South Asia, but in Africa as well, has proven to be vastly more effective counterbalance to China's behavior than anything much that the US has done. But I'm interested in what you may have seen in Japan's national security strategy that indicates that this is in fact a priority for Tokyo beyond the point about not falling into the trap of dividing the world into autocracy and democracy. I mean, Japan has been phenomenally and effectively diplomatically active, but is that really captured as a policy imperative in the national security strategy? And you say that Japan appreciates that countries don't want to have to choose between the West and China, and I get the point that you said about democracy versus autocracy, but what do you see and what would you point to that makes it clear that this document is less ideological, particularly when it comes to China, or maybe putting it in a better way than ideological, is that it's less us versus them? Is it just that the Japanese are more dainty in how they tiptoe around the formulas about China, or is it something beyond that? But why don't I stop here and turn it back to you?
Okay, well, we've gone over our time limits and that creates some problems. I would say that those who have to leave, please leave, and maybe just a minute or so of comments of responses from each of the participants. And then we will just have to close without question and answer, which is something I've never wanted to do, and I'm very sorry we're in that situation. So let me just start with Yuki, and just a minute or so, and then we'll go through the four of us and wrap up.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tom and Danny, for your very useful comments. Definitely agree. I would need to explore a little bit more into what kind of things that Japan has been doing, particularly in the area of development assistance, and what Tokyo has been doing since of its time through Suga and Kishida, that how Japan is approaching. And I think I would try to do a better job in my final draft in contextualizing what Kishida said in his speech in India in terms of Japan's Indo-Pacific free and open Indo-Pacific region versus Japan's overall national security strategy, which I agree with Danny that China really comes out strong as it's Japan's greatest security concern for the foreseeable future. So I would definitely try to more contextualize those things and connecting those dots.
Thank you. Katrin?
Okay, so again, thank you both for your excellent comments. Okay, to sum up, I guess, these great comments and questions, one think about thinking them out kind of all at once, what matters in these documents and how resilient are they to shocks. So what I would say, like, agree with you on strategy, but there are things that jumped out here. And what they said to me was, this is what the UN administration feels it can get away with. That we need to know the lineage for, like we wouldn't have to in the document. And that includes Japan, just mentioning Japan, and as well as the things sensitive to China. So those two things, I think, maybe not predictive, but just say something about this current moment. On North Korea, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's predictive. If there's a crisis, South Korea is going to have to focus on North Korea. I think this document does not read that we are really shifting our, if something happens with North Korea, this is not saying, oh, because of this strategy, we put it down to your point of policies. That's not going to happen, so that creates some degree of skepticism over, this strategy. So the resilience, on the resilience side, what gives you cover for this? A lot of it has to do with North Korea's behavior. It's cover, right?
Yeah.
So that resilience doesn't just have to do with internal, that's what internally gives you this. Look at 98, look at the financial crisis can be a different time, right? But like everyone gets called a traitor in South Korean politics. Anything else, that's not right.
But it seems
you
pretty
might get away
intense
with
now.
it. Nonetheless, you might get away with it because of the intensity of what's going on in North Korea, because you can't afford to fight, right? You're safe enough to fight a lot of time. You're not safe enough to fight, right? It's indulgent on some level, right? So that's what gives him cover, and that's of course the next factor. And also the global Korea reduction policy. I mean, Kathy's made this point really well in past. This is new, and it's not just the progressive. I shouldn't give the
It's not just
impression.
K-pop.
It's not just, it's pride in what Korea has achieved. And I think that's why if you can grow this, it actually will have some kind of basis that resonates. And that's what really jumped out.
Thank you. Susanna, please.
Very briefly, I think the point that Tom raised about the sort of how this could change in future and the susceptibility to shocks is a really good one. I suppose one sort of broader comment and reflection on the discussion might just be to say that I think, the US has done a great job. The Biden administration has done a great job in revitalizing the alliance with the Philippines. And the Philippines is important, especially in the context of Taiwan, South China Sea. But in terms of shaping the broader regional debate within Southeast Asia about the US and China, whether the roles played by those two countries are constructive or not, what the shape of future economic engagement from those two countries looks like, Indonesia is far more consequential. Far more important in shaping that ASEAN consensus. And so I would just urge that, that in sort of considering how effective US Indo-Pacific strategy has been in Southeast Asia, that always needs to be front of mind. Thanks.
Thank you. I will just conclude by saying I think that we've had a fantastic discussion, and the comments have been right on and really helpful. Tom has raised questions about the US, and I think they come up from others. And as much as we can speak positively about what's happened over the last year or two, there are so many question marks and so much more to do. And the US-China competition is going to go on for a long time. And the Ukraine war still is with us, and we don't know, as Tom brought up, whether China's position will shift on that in a way that could be very significant. Apparently, Macron didn't have any impact on that. And so I think Tom has pointed us to some future issues, like where will India be? And I agree with Yuki that pay a lot of attention to that India, Kishida's visit to India. There's a lot in the Japanese press about what that meant, and it's a very interesting visit just 2 weeks ago. So thank you all for coming, and I hope we will get this journal out expeditiously, and you'll have a chance to read the final products. Thank you.